Well, welcome to today's panel where we're going to be debating how tech and digitally data-driven technologies and artificial intelligence can have public legitimacy. My name is Imogen Parker. I head up the Nuffield Foundation's programs on justice, rights and digital society. But the reason that questions of public legitimacy when it comes to tech and AI have really been front of mind is that I'm leading the design and development of a new institution, the Ada Lovelace Institute, which you might have heard mentioned at a couple of sessions earlier today. Now that's being led by Nuffield, but it's actually going to be a partnership. We're working with 8 other organisations, including the Royal Society, the British Academy, the Royal Statistical Society, the Alan Turing Institute, Wellcome, the Imogen Network, and Tech UK, a long but great list. And Ada's being created to act as an independent research and ethics body tasked to ensure that data and artificial intelligence work for people and society. And it's going to do that by convening diverse voices, to build really a shared terminology around these issues, the social and ethical questions. It's going to undertake research to better understand how individuals, how groups, and how society as a whole are affected by these technologies. And then the really tough bit, it wants to guide ethical practice in the development and deployment of these technologies. And it's going to do that by taking ethical test cases, convening and engaging in public deliberation, and really coming up with recommendations, tools and frameworks on what ethical practice should look like. So it's quite a challenging agenda, and questions of public legitimacy and how you do good public deliberation are important because it's something that the Ada Lovelace Institute are going to have to do. We want to do it well. It's also questions we've been thinking about because we need to act with public legitimacy as a body that's seeking to speak on behalf of people and society. So these are some challenging questions for us as well. How can we make sure we really are engaging with voices and publics and representing their views? How do we do that well? So it's a question that I've been thinking about, but I'm certainly not the only person thinking about these questions. Trust and sudden erosion of public trust have been front of mind, I'd say, in a lot of AI events recently, since Facebook and Cambridge Analytica provided a perfect case study in a sudden loss of public trust. Recently at the UN summit on AI for Good, they had 4 tracks. One of them was around health and how you can do that to help people and society. One of the tracks was about how do we build trust. I mean, industry are really getting that this is vital. But I'd argue it's not the right goal for industry. Industry shouldn't be aiming for more trust. Some of you might have seen Baroness Honora O'Neill, the renowned philosopher, speak yesterday. If you didn't, I would highly recommend you check out her TED Talk from 2013, where she tears apart the aim for more trust and instead challenges it, saying the proper goal for society should be intelligently placed and intelligently refused trust. So actually what we're aiming for is not trust, but it's trustworthiness, and that's really one of the key words I want to think about today. But trustworthy, it's a better word, it's still not sufficient. When it comes to data-driven systems and artificial intelligence, it can be a challenge. The ability to decipher, to decide, and then to act on whether or not something is trustworthy is pretty limited. It can be limited because of low understanding and little transparency. It's hard to figure out whether something is trustworthy. It's hard to figure out what their business model is. It's hard to figure out potential harms that might arise from sharing data or information. It's hard to act because of the huge disparity in investment and expertise that sits behind these systems. There's a lot of great work being done to encourage you to share and to engage and to keep sharing and keep engaging. There's lots of good work done around stickiness and shariness, I'd say, and that can cut across the way that we might engage based on trustworthiness. And lastly, in some areas, there's a lack of choice, either because of monopolies or a lack of perceived choice, perhaps because of network effects. It might be that you don't think Facebook is trustworthy anymore, but you think your life would somehow be meaningfully limited if you disengaged. So for those reasons, I think we need to care about trustworthiness, but we need a couple of other words in the mix, and one of those is public legitimacy. artificial intelligence has the power, huge power and force to shape society, to shape jobs, to shape relationships, to shape information, and questions about whether it can shape opinion and whether it can shape action as well. How can we make sure that these powerful forces behave with legitimacy? What is a reasonable settlement between citizens or users or consumers that are affected by these forces and those who wield these forces? So that's one word I want to keep in the frame. And the last word I want to think about is responsive. How can these systems be responsive to changing public values? I had an event a couple of months ago that when streetlights were first introduced, when public streetlights first kind of introduced in the UK, there was a backlash on the grounds of privacy. People thought that was a violation of their privacy to be able to see where they were going of an evening, who was coming in and out of their front door when it was dark. So we have to accept that people's values and where they're willing to put trade-offs are going to be affected by what technology can offer and what things we find useful or comfortable. So I'm going to leave it there by way of introduction, and I'm now going to invite our 4 excellent speakers to provide a short talk, kind of bringing their different perspectives to this question of how on earth can we make sure tech behaves with public legitimacy. So the first speaker I'm going to introduce is Tim Hughes, who is Director of Involve. So engaging in public deliberation and these questions is very much your bread and butter. Tim.
Great, thank you, Imogen, and thank you very much for having me today. So Involve is a public participation charity. We've been around for almost 15 years now, kind of grappling with many of these questions in all sorts of different sectors. And technology and kind of data and innovation is one area that we've kind of consistently worked in, along with a whole host of other issues around kind of health and social care, education, a whole gamut of different policy issues. But we do that because we believe the public needs to have a voice. They need to be central to decisions about how our country works in the future. And decisions that particularly affect how we live, how we work, how we play, and ultimately how we die must be rooted in the way that people kind of understand their own values and what they want out of their life and society and the communities in which they live. There's something that policymakers often refer to called the Overton Window, which is about the space of kind of possibilities for policymaking. And essentially the boundaries of the Overton Window are what's not acceptable to the public. So one way to think about public legitimacy is actually the consent that the public gives for particular courses of action and what fits and what doesn't fit within the Overton Window. But it can be quite hard to actually understand what that space is, and also what are the criteria that people place on whether things are kind of within the bounds of something that's acceptable or not within the bounds of something that's acceptable. And on the other side, I think there's a fair amount of cynicism often from experts, from policymakers, about the role that the public can play in policymaking, and also particularly policymaking around some of these big kind of complex and technical topics like AI. So the messages that I want to kind of leave you with today are that it's possible, it's important, but actually we need to start to think about it differently in the future, particularly for technologies like AI. So to quickly kind of touch on the it's possible bit. So my organisation has been involved in a government programme called Sciencewise for a number of years now. And Sciencewise was set up almost 15 years ago as well, like Involve, to run public dialogues around new and emerging science and technology policies. And over that time, it's ran over 50 public dialogues on all sorts of different kind of really complex and controversial scientific and technological kind of policy issues. And it's along with programs in other countries. There's kind of a similar program in Denmark. It's really shown that the public can engage in a kind of really deep and meaningful way with some of these really kind of complex and controversial topics. So one example of a recent dialogue it ran was around the technology of mitochondrial replacement therapy. So this is essentially kind of gene editing. It would allow the mitochondria from one person to be replaced and prevent disease being passed on to children. So it has a fantastic kind of medical application, but also profound kind of ethical and social implications as well, and a whole host of different uses that it could be put to, some that people might consider to be to the public benefit, and many others that people might not consider to be to the public benefit. So the Sciencewise model brings together groups of randomly selected citizens. So anybody from this room could conceivably be selected to take part in one of these processes. And it works by giving people the information to really understand the technology, understand what are the potential implications, and then also the time and the space in which to deliberate with other people and to weigh up the pros and cons and really kind of get to grips with what they think about the technology in question and what the policy should be around it. And in the case of the mitochondrial replacement therapy process, the public came up with a really reasonable and nuanced set of recommendations back to policymakers. So previously, anything to do with mitochondrial replacement had been completely banned. The public said, well, actually, no, we think in certain circumstances it should be used because there's a public and a health benefit there. But what we're particularly interested in is kind of who benefits from it, so ensuring it's kind of patients rather than maybe kind of private interests. And we're interested in the regulation and the oversight that sits around it. So I think in a similar way to what might be the case with AI, it's less about the particular use sometimes, and it's more about kind of what is the architecture that needs to sit around something to give the public confidence that it will be used in the public benefits and it will match with their values. So the difference between that type of public engagement and many forms of public engagement that we see on a day-to-day basis is that kind of time and space, and it's that kind of deep deliberation that the public can have and allows them to kind of reach very kind of nuanced and very informed positions on things. We've run these processes around all sorts of different other policy topics as well, things like Brexit and social care recently, but it has a really kind of important application for science and technology innovations because it kind of critically can deal with those really complex issues. So the key is kind of giving people the time and space to really kind of get to grips. But it's also important to think about the framing of what the public is being asked. And rarely are the decisions that we kind of face around things like AI kind of solely kind of technical kind of science or technology questions. It's about kind of the interaction of those technologies with society. And that's something where the public can have a really important role in setting those parameters. So it's about thinking what the trajectory for those technologies should be in the future. It's about really kind of critically thinking about who are the winners and the losers from a technology, and also then what needs to be put in to either ensure that the losers don't lose out too much, or that the winners, kind of some of that is kind of distributed to the rest of society. It's about kind of what is the role of governance in this? Where is the right place for regulation, and where is it not? And then also, what is the desirable use of these technologies, and where might we find other ways to solve these problems instead that's more in line with what the public thinks? But of course, public opinion isn't static, as Imogen has already said. So the Overton window moves over time. And that's why it's really important, particularly on topics like AI, which will be so kind of integral to our lives in the future, to have a much more kind of ongoing debate and interaction with the public. And some of that can happen not through kind of formal policy processes, but through kind of through culture. It can happen through TV and film and art as well. But really finding kind of new ways to inform the public about the potential trade-offs of these technologies, but also kind of critically kind of raising questions rather than necessarily kind of providing solutions and contributing to that wider deliberation. But then we do need those opportunities to check in with what the public thinks from time to time as well around particular issues, or kind of more broadly about a technology like AI. And things like kind kind of public deliberations, citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries can be a really important way of doing that, and we'll hear some examples of those from some of the other panellists. So I'll leave it there. I hope I've convinced you that it's important, it's possible, but we also need to do it a little bit differently.
Fantastic, thanks Tim. Now over to Natalie Banner, who leads the Wellcome initiative, Understanding Patient Data, to provide a bit of a health perspective on where the public are and how you engage with them on these really important questions.
Thanks very much, Imogen, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. So Understanding Patient Data is an independent initiative supported and hosted by Wellcome to support conversations about the way that health data, so data that's collected within the context of the health service, can be used for purposes beyond individuals' own care, so particularly for research purposes. And of course, new technologies, AI, machine learning, and so on, are going to be, and already are, a very, very important part of the way that that data could potentially be used in future. The interesting thing about AI, I think, is that the ubiquity, the scale, the sheer range of different uses and the different kinds of impacts it will have, or even is having already, on different sectors of society, on different kinds of people, makes AI quite different from other dual-use technologies, where you may be able to sort of make clearer distinctions about impacts on society, benefits, and potential misuses of that technology. And this makes it very hard to make the case for public legitimacy, talking about AI as a whole field. It encompasses so much that the only way you can really talk about it as a whole field is to go so high level and to encompass everything that you end up not really being able to say very much at all. You end up talking in vague terms, high abstract principles. And the risk of doing that is that you can kind of end up either in the sort of heavily hyped scenario and sort of overselling the ideas, or you can kind of end up with this sort of dystopic, hellish vision of the future. So when you're talking in those kind of vague, high principle terms, it's very hard to get to grips with or to get across to patients and to members of the public what this technology is about, how it's going to be used. And we found from public dialogues and dialogue exercises that we've run with members of the public, in my case, looking at attitudes towards commercial access to data. This wasn't about AI specifically, but it was about sort of the commercial model of accessing data. Also, the Royal Society have done work looking at attitudes towards machine learning. And we are supporting at the moment a dialogue that's being run with the Academy of Medical Sciences looking at patient, public and clinician views about new technologies in healthcare. In all of these cases, if you can provide the sort of specific use cases and concrete examples, as Tim said, people can grasp these and they're also very interested and engaged. And certainly we've found that people can really grasp the opportunities and see real benefits, but they're also interested in the kind of risks and the concerns, and they have lots of questions. But if you have to get down into the specifics and the concrete details. If you zoom up into the abstract, you very, very quickly lose people. I want to also draw on another aspect for exploring legitimacy specific to AI, and that is the fact that AI relies on data to develop it in the first place. This is very often data about us, and can I just say, even if it is anonymized, if that is feasible, which I know is a question, it doesn't mean that people don't care what happens to it. And this is certainly true of health data. Even if it is anonymized, people still want to know that it's being used in a good and useful way. So the question for legitimacy here is not just about the outputs of AI and the kind of products that are developed, it's about the methodologies used to develop it in the first place. And in the healthcare sector, this is really, really important. There are two very different narratives going on around the way that data could be used for data-driven technologies, including AI, in the UK. On the one hand, if you heard earlier the sort of government ideas around the industrial strategy, there's a strong narrative about UK PLC, what assets we have for data, the idea that particularly data that's held within the NHS is something of a gold mine. On the other side, from the public and patient perspective, they want to see this data being used for public good, that it needs to be protected. They're not necessarily against the idea of commercial involvement in the use of data, but they want to be sure that there is that public and societal benefit coming through very, very strongly. So there's a very interesting conflict there in the narratives between those two things. But thinking about it in this way, and the way that the data is used, data about us is used to develop AI, helps us think about the legitimacy question, I think, from a slightly different angle. And that is to say, well, actually, it's not just about what companies can do to sort of prove their public legitimacy, but also what can we do to help empower and enable the publics to scrutinize AI, to ask the difficult questions, to hold people to account and say, well, hang on, what's your business model here? How is this data being used? Who is this benefiting? Who haven't you spoken to? Who aren't you considering when you're developing these tools and technologies? And actually, that's the role we see for ourselves at understanding patient data, is by providing that information in a meaningful, accessible way, helping inform people, that enables them to be better equipped to ask some of these difficult questions. And actually, the culture of the technology industry is very much equipped to be able to do this, right? You're about creating a culture that is user-centered, very information-rich, very proactive, has the potential to be, more transparent and so on. That kind of culture is actually the right one for enabling people to ask these questions, equipping people, giving them agency, enabling them and empowering them to ask these difficult questions, because we're not just passive recipients of this technology. So my takeaway from this is that the question about legitimacy, a huge part of the puzzle here, is to try and rebalance this power gradient, to enable publics to be equipped, to give them the agency to judge for themselves, judge for ourselves, whether we think the uses, the development and also the uses of AI are in fact legitimate.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, Brhmie Balaram, who works at the Royal Society of Arts and is leading their current public deliberation work on the ethics of AI, and is going to share some of that kind of early findings.
Great, thank you, Imogen, and hi everyone. So the RSA is currently undertaking public engagement on the ethics of AI, and we're doing this in partnership with DeepMind, and we're specifically exploring the question of how people feel about automated decision systems being made, or decision-making being made with AI. And I'm going to talk to you about some of our findings and our early takeaways for others considering taking public engagement in AI forward. So ahead of the jury, we actually undertook a survey with YouGov to find out more about public attitudes towards AI for decision-making. And what we found is that only a third of the public were aware that about the use of automated decision systems. And that when it comes to their use in the criminal justice system and in the workplace, for example, people really aren't aware of this. So only 9% of people were aware about its use in the criminal justice system, and only 14% of people were aware of its use in the workplace. And actually, when we asked them how people felt about it, whether or not they supported these uses, 60% said that they were opposed to its use in the workplace, as well as its use in the criminal justice system. So that's a really high figure. And when we got into questions of why people felt the way that they did, so why are they concerned about these particular uses, the number one reason was that people felt that these systems didn't have enough compassion or empathy in order to be able to make these sorts of important decisions. And the second reason was that people felt like if we were turning to these systems, we were actually kind of displacing accountability or enabling ethical distance from important decisions. So in our citizens' juries, we actually wanted to get behind some of these views and dig a little deeper. And so what this means in practice is that we've brought together 25 to 30 citizens who are drawn from across England and Wales, and they've come together to deliberate and discuss some of these issues. So they're drawn from a diverse range of backgrounds. We've accounted for things like diversity in age and socioeconomic background, in ethnicity, ability, and then also just in terms of their different attitudes towards technology, so positive, negative, neutral. And when they are involved in this process, they're hearing from experts and they're able to engage in a conversation on an equal footing with these experts over a course of a number of sessions over a number of months. And as part of this process, what they're trying to do is reach sort of a conclusion about under what conditions is it appropriate to use automated decision systems. So we're not just interested in their views about whether or not it's okay to use these systems, but it's about really trying to understand what would make people feel comfortable with the use of these systems. And so far, the citizens have actually come up with a range of conditions. So they've looked at what conditions would be appropriate at a technical level, what conditions would be appropriate at an organizational or institutional level, and then also what's appropriate at a societal level. So for example, they've discussed the need for there to always be a human in the loop, so somebody to audit the inputs as well as the outputs and to continually monitor the outcomes to ensure that the outcomes are fair and that they're accurate. They've also clarified their need for an explanation, so they've noted that it's important for them to understand the sort of organizational process. So it's not just about opening up the black box and trying to understand what's happening technically, but trying to understand how are people actually using the predictions that are being generated to make a final decision as a human. So what sort of weight are we giving the prediction that's being made relative to the other factors? And this is still an ongoing process for us. So we started the citizens' juries in May. We had another one in June, and it will conclude in October. But there's some early takeaways for others in industry and in policy as they consider taking forward public engagement. So the first Natalie kind of touched on, which is, we need to be much more specific about our focus. We've taken a really specific approach in terms of the way that we're talking about AI. So it's not just about AI in general terms, but we're talking specifically about decision making. So there's, as we all know, there are many use cases, and I think it would be too overwhelming to think about regulating AI in general because we're afraid of things like stemming its overall potential. So when we have this conversation with citizens, we can't be broad. It would be too much to talk about all AI and every single concern. It's not manageable, and we need to be able to contain the topic. So we've narrowed our focus to one particular concern or controversial use, which then helps us to have a deeper and more meaningful discussion that will lead to concrete actions. And the second point that I want to make, which follows on from that, is that with any public engagement exercise, and particularly deliberative dialogues like ours, we need to have an actionable outcome. And that means that decision makers and influencers and other power holders need to commit to acting on the citizens' insights. And we're really fortunate to be working with DeepMind, which is one of the world's leading AI companies, because they're really committed to the process and they want to act on its outcomes. But we're also engaging other stakeholders as part of this process. So for example, in our last session, the ICO attended, and they heard from the citizens in terms of what citizens thought a good explanation would be for automated decision systems. And we hope that that will actually feed into the ICO and Alan Turing Institute's framework on on how to make an ethical, or how to provide an ethical explanation for these sorts of decisions. And the final point that I just kind of wanted to make about these sort of takeaways is the outcome of citizen engagement processes should not be predetermined by those facilitating the process. So if you're going into this and you're already thinking about what you want out of it in terms of what you think the citizens will recommend as an actionable outcome, I think that's really problematic. Because we should be really open to what the citizens think might be necessary, and that includes if the citizens feel like regulation might be appropriate. I personally don't think that we should immediately set off alarm bells when we talk about regulation. I know that a lot of people are wary of regulation because they're worried that it might stifle innovation, but I think this is also because regulation is normally associated with red tape and bureaucracy, and people tend to think of it being top-down. But actually, it doesn't always need to be that way, and it can be about encouraging a positive vision or better standards, and it can be much more collaborative in practice. So especially when you involve a wide range of stakeholders, including citizens. I don't think that citizens necessarily have to be engaged on everything all the time, but I think that if a public body is going to introduce a particularly controversial use of AI for decision making, then that is the right time for the public to be engaged. So for example, I think something that we might want to consider is, the Met Police are currently rolling out facial recognition technologies to help make decisions about whom to stop on the streets. And it'd be really interesting to kind of see if we could do some sort of public engagement process around that.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And lastly, Hilary Sutcliffe, who is the director of SocietyInside and has engaged on lots of different kind of ethical issues arising from tech. Most recently in the AI space, was involved in the World Economic Forum publication on human rights, discrimination and machine learning. So I think you're going to give us a bit of a lessons learned, what to do, what not to do. Is that right?
That's right. And I can see we're now really sharp on time, so I'll be trying to run through this. So SocietyInside is a riff on Intel Inside, this idea that society's needs and wants will be at the heart of innovation instead of just making money or scientific kudos. And I've worked across technologies from biotech, nanotech, synthetic biology, robotics, a little bit on AI, and also most recently an oversight project on the governance of quantum tech, and that was a bit of a brain stretch. So these lessons I'm giving you here, these 5 lessons are lessons from what has happened in all these technologies, which seems to be shockingly recurring technology after technology. So I'm hoping you guys are going to learn these lessons. The first one is to, what I'm calling, beware the tyranny of the ology. So this idea, we have nanotechnology, we have information technology. These are brands, and these brands were developed to get money out of research councils and investors. But they come with their own problems. So if AI is everything from pattern recognition to the singularity, you're really making life difficult for yourselves here. Because how is the public going to negotiate their understanding of that if it means everything? But as soon as there's some money in AI, lo and behold, the people will flock to it. So I think we have to be really careful with that. One of the issues, Greenpeace was involved very much in nanotechnology. And what they said is, we spent 10 years discussing this whole, what is this ology all about? When actually what we should have been focusing on is what are we worried about and what are we not worried about? And letting the stuff that we're not worried about flourish and get on with itself. So the second one of that, which is the hype that they've mentioned, hype really has consequences. Which are often not thought through in advance. So if you remember, nuclear was supposed to give us energy too cheap to meter. GM was going to be the end of hunger. And one you probably won't know, the US National Cancer Institute's 2004 aspiration that nano would end cancer by 2015, which is not looking so hot, is it? But what you've got to be aware of that is regulators also make regulation based on what industry says and anticipates it's going to do. And that also makes a different sort of governance framework than you might actually be expecting and hoping for. So don't think that just because it's hyping up, just because you're going to investors, you're going to research councils, because you have to sort of puff it up to get the money, that is not a cost-free process. But also, people have got a fairly good bullshit radar, to be honest. And I don't think they even swallow it anyway. So you're almost wasting your time doing it, because I feel that causes vestiges of distrust. Because they think, oh, yeah, right, I've seen that before. So I would say to you guys, calm down, keep it real, down to earth about real problems that people can get their heads around. Because also, we've seen things like Theranos, there are implications of having to do that and having to keep up with your own sort of hype that will cause you problems in the long run. But this thing of wider impact matters. It really does matter. We've seen it in lots of different technologies. But one of the work I did on irresponsible innovation instead of responsible innovation, all irresponsible innovations were perfectly good ideas developed for a really good reason that either because they were then developed at scale or because something went a little tiny bit wrong somewhere along the way, they then became really problematic as technologies. Now, whether that's asbestos or CFCs or sorts of other different ones, nobody's expecting, except in Hollywood films and defense departments, you to invent something maliciously bad. It's just that it goes a bit wrong somewhere along the way. So that other lesson is to embrace good governance. We've heard a lot, including from the House of Lords, governance restricts technology. It's actually rubbish. Bad governance restricts technology. What good governance does is give a level playing field, and it gives some basis of moving forward so that the technology can be used effectively and appropriately. So good organizations, good technologies embrace good governance. We have a World Economic Forum project again on trust in governance. Everyone talks about the trust in the technology. We really must make sure that they trust us as a technology. You've also got to make sure that your governance is trustworthy, and therefore do get involved in shaping and creating good governance with different stakeholders. But the thing that's come to me as the real issue after all of these different technologies and many, many years is that we're never going to catch them all. We're not going to catch all the problems, particularly now. It's going very fast. It's going globally. There's lots of reasons. So for me, the big learning is think about early warnings. Part of the issue is that mentally we're not really equipped to spot early warnings in advance and do something about them. So I would say to you guys as well, within your own organisations and within the industry as a whole, keep an eye out for early warnings of problems that you can head off before they become disasters. And the final one really is, don't obsess about a public backlash before it's even happened. The big lessons from these technologies as well, and nano's been a great one for that, is this nanophobia phobia. We're so worried about a public backlash, we get so defensive about our technologies in the first place, that we actually then stimulate public distrust simply by the way that we approach public opinion. So I think I can see that with you guys as well. This idea of the public, what are we going to do about the public? You know, we've got to get them to trust us. Don't obsess about it. Create good quality, beneficial technologies that people want and need, and you won't even get a public backlash. So those are my lessons. Give them something that they want, and you'll all make money, everybody will be fine, and everybody will be happy. Thank you.
Well, on that note, it seems like we've pretty much solved the question at issue. Just got a couple of minutes left, so I just want to go once more down the panel and ask you for your kind of 30-second pitch, I suppose, on why tech companies should care about public values and public legitimacy when it doesn't always hit the bottom line if they don't. So what's the case that we should be making to them and to others in this room? Tim?
So I think my pitch would be that even if it doesn't look as though it's going to impact your bottom line, it could very well at some point, and it's kind of that, it's the crisis moment that you want to prevent. It's that backlash that Hilary was talking about that might never come, but it might, and then it could undermine your business model. So I think one example that's often used is the example of genetically modified foods, and the fact that there was the kind of the public engagement around that technology was so poor it led to a backlash that then any kind of work around genetically modified anything for the next number of years was completely kind of frozen. So I think my pitch would be that even if it doesn't quite look like it's going to impact you, it could very well.
Fantastic. Natalie?
Thanks, Imogen. I would say that even if it doesn't seem to impact your bottom line right now, it could well do in the long run. And if you don't try and get things right now, then eventually governments will regulate, and they might regulate in a way that's not very productive for you. So I would take on board Hilary's point about good governance and actually getting engaged in what that looks like. It's not necessarily always going to be your role to get everything right, but as Hilary said, I think if you have the governance system around technology, and you can actually sort of be part of creating that good and constructive and helpful facilitative governance, then that's going to be the way forward.
Brilliant, thank you. Brhmie?
So I would agree with both of those points. I guess what I want people to keep in mind is that it's not just technology companies that are using AI in these ways. I think it's also increasingly public bodies. And so I would actually encourage public bodies to think about how they engage the public in what they're doing, and so integrating it into their strategy rather than thinking of it as a nice to have or just an add-on, and then just making sure that they set a budget aside for it.
Fantastic, thanks. And Hilary?
And just think about it as market research. These guys won't like that, but if they're not going to like it and they're not going to use it in the way you're going to think, you're not going to sell any. So go out and talk to them and consider it learning and due diligence for the future of your product.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for your time today. We're out of time. I believe we are going to be going and doing questions and following someone with a sign at some point. But I just like you to thank all these great speakers for this discussion today.